All right, guys. Hi, this is Corey Christensen. As Troy mentioned, I do volunteer at Air and Space, and I am the AEC coordinator here at the Journey Museum and Learning Center. That's me petting a buffalo. I'm going to be talking about Amelia Earhart today. She is such a unique figure in women's history. In her short lifetime, she achieved so much, and I think that's what has drawn me to her over the years. Even as a child, I was always very interested in Amelia Earhart and what she achieved. One of my very earliest, clearest memories is walking into the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum and seeing Amelia's red plane hanging up, and I don't even know if it's still hanging up there or not. So what I'm going to be doing today is talking about Amelia Earhart, her life, her achievements, and how she relates to South Dakota. So Amelia Earhart was born July 24th, 1897. She was born in Atchison, Kansas, and she was a tomboy. As a child, she would build roller coasters in her backyard, and she would climb trees and go swimming and do things that maybe little girls weren't necessarily supposed to do at that time. She did, however, have a strong opinion of planes from a very young age. And that opinion was that she thought they were ugly, she thought they were boring, and she thought they were loud. And so she wasn't necessarily very fond of airplanes as a child. And as we all know, that changed, but I think it's just interesting and kind of funny that that was her opinion. And that did change. Her belief system did change about planes. As Amelia Earhart grew up, she became more and more independent from her family. She actually ended up going to Canada and visiting her sister for a while in Toronto. And while she was there, she volunteered as a nurse's aide in a hospital in Toronto during World War I. And so this is time frame 1917 to 1919. And she worked with soldiers returning from the war front. And during her time in Canada, she visited an air show. She went to an air show and watched the planes fly. And her friend were watching a particular plane, and the pilot saw them. And so the pilot, as Amelia Earhart guessed later, she actually watched the pilot come towards her, and she believed he was thinking that he would try to make them scamper out of the way. And Amelia Earhart stood her ground. Her friend scampered, but she stood her ground. And she later said, "I did not understand it at the time, but I believe that little red airplane said something to me as it swished by." And that changed her whole outlook on planes. What you can see on the screen, you see two photos there. The photo on the left is a photo of Amelia Earhart and her pilot trainer, Netta Snook. And Netta Snook began training Amelia Earhart to fly on January 3rd, 1921. Later that same year, Amelia Earhart had saved up enough money to buy her own plane, which is the photo on the right. It was called the Kinner Airster, nicknamed the Canary, and it was a biplane, and it was yellow. Amelia Earhart flew in multiple different planes as time went on. And she didn't pilot all of them, but I thought it important to talk about each plane that she was in. So starting in the upper left-hand corner, that is an Fokker F-7 Friendship. That was the plane that she flew in during the flight from the transatlantic flight that she was a passenger in, and that made her the first female to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. And then on the upper right is the Avro Avian. It was bought in 1928. And that plane actually belonged to a English woman who used it and broke records with it, and so Amelia Earhart bought it after that. The third plane on there on the lower left is the Lockheed Vega 5B, which was bought in 1929. That is her red plane, and Amelia Earhart, of course, is standing there with it. You can see at that point she is wearing trousers, and we'll talk about that later. And then on the lower right is the Lockheed Electra, which is the plane that she and Fred Noonan disappeared in. I'm not going to read all of these because I know how it goes when you read off a screen, but the records and the flights that you see up on the screen here are incredibly important. The amount of records she broke from 1921, when she started training to be a pilot, to 1937, 16 years, is incredible. She was, of course, breaking women's altitude records in 1922. 1928 is when she flew across the Atlantic Ocean in the F-7 in the Friendship. She was a passenger at that point, but she did later become the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic in 14 hours and 56 minutes. These are just some of the records she set. And I think my favorite one is that she set 2 women's nonstop transcontinental speed records. That's across the United States. The first one she set in 1932 in 19 hours and 5 minutes, and then in 1933 she broke her own record with a time of 17 hours and 7 minutes. So we'll let you guys look at that for just a second here. And then she met a man. Amelia Earhart met George Putnam in 1930-ish while she was preparing for her flight across the Atlantic, which didn't happen until 1932, but he became her friend first, and then she actually ended up marrying him on February 7th of 1931. And this again shows kind of her independence and her, I would almost put it as stubbornness, because she didn't conform to what marriage thoughts were at the time. She actually referred to the marriage as a partnership with dual control. And in newspapers, interestingly enough, she's referred to, so if it's a newspaper article talking about Amelia Earhart post her marriage, she is actually referred to first as Amelia Earhart Putnam. So it's not necessarily a hyphenated last name, but they do recognize all 3 parts of her name. And then after that, in the same article, she's referred to as Earhart. They don't use her married name. And I don't know if that's because up until that point, she had been recognized for so many of her records as Amelia Earhart, or if it's just because she would prefer it that way and the newspapers were making her happy in a sense, I guess. I believe it is probably the former, that they just recognized her for the records that she had set when she was single versus married. That is George Putnam there in the photo. And then in 1932, her transatlantic flight was a major record, because no one could even imagine that a woman could do that. So in 1932, she was awarded 2 different medals. She was awarded a gold medal by the National Geographic Society, and you can see it there on the screen. And then she was also given the Distinguished Flying Cross by Congress. And the people presenting it to her was the Congressman of California, and then a member of the government in Kansas was also there presenting it to her. and she was the first woman to ever receive a Distinguished Flying Cross. She was not only a pilot, and we need to remember that, and this is where I think it gets interesting about who Amelia Earhart was. She was not a fan of wearing skirts in the pilot seat. She was not a fan of wearing skirts while flying. And so what she did was she actually ended up designing a line of clothing. This is from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, January 4th of 1934. She is showing off some of her pieces that she's designing. And it's not only for female pilots. It's made for, as the newspaper said, the tailored girl. These were sports clothes. They were considered sporty yet still presentable, something that women could wear on trips, on business, if they were involved in business. These clothing were designed and based on pieces of planes. And so some of the buttons and zippers would have gears on them, or they'd have propellers on them, and things similar to that. They were comfort forward. They were designed to be comfortable, and they introduced the idea of slacks for women. That wasn't a unique idea at the time. There were women talking about wearing pants more and more, but the line made sure to have slacks available to women. She also designed her own flying suit with a zipper closing piece. And this line was actually made available at Macy's in New York. I mean, it was a big deal. Her other endeavors included writing books. Her husband, George Putnam, was actually an author and a publisher himself, and so he helped her publish these books. The fun of it is a book about her experiences as a female pilot. It also talks about experience of other female pilots. And then the 20 hours, 40 minutes, Our Flight in the Friendship was about her first flight across the Atlantic Ocean. And there was a third book written about Amelia Earhart. That book was written after her disappearance by her husband. And she was opinionated. Amelia Earhart was a very opinionated woman, and that did not always make her well-liked. She, not only did she write books and was she a pilot, but she also went from university to university, and she worked with Congress. She spoke at a lot of different programs, but she always ended up expressing her opinion. And so, for example, while she was at Congress, she was pushing them to better regulate the movement of goods and using aviation systems, using planes. And not everybody was a fan of that. Not everybody thought that that was the right thing to do. But here, she was very opinionated about war, and it's unknown if that stems from her experiences as a nurse during World War I, or if it stems from just the way she was raised in Kansas. But she was very opinionated, and her opinion was that war was ridiculous. It was wasteful. And she stated this, of course, what you see on the screen, but she also stated that women should be treated no differently from men. They should be drafted, made to do the dirty work, and real fighting instead of dressing up and parading down the street. She went on to say that women in the armies would make two nations lining up on the battlefield even more ludicrous than they are now. I found that fascinating, that she was so opinionated about war in a time where patriotism was extremely important. And the newspapers latched onto that. They listened to her and they wrote up what she said. And so, of course, I think that she probably got in a little bit of trouble. So where's her connection to South Dakota? How does this all come to be? After a lot of her flights happened, Amelia Earhart decided to take a cross-country trip with her husband. And if you saw my presentation Up in Thin Air, you'll recognize this photo. Amelia Earhart decided to stop in South Dakota and check out the straddle bowl and gondola, as her relationship with the National Geographic Society was one of a positive, note. And she was friends with Major Kepner and Captain Stevens. And so she was able to go and visit the gondola and visit the straddle bowl area and talk to the men and pose for a picture. And she voiced the opinion that flights should always launch from the straddle bowl area. She said it was the perfect place for balloon launches because the way it was shaped, which the National Geographic Society had decided originally. And so it was a good support of the flights that they were planning. At this point, the Explorer 1 hadn't even lifted off yet. This visit happened on the 13th of July in 1934. And so the Explorer 1 wouldn't lift off for another couple of months after that. She was also very impressed with the scenery of South Dakota. She thought it was beautiful, but she had to move on. She was bummed. She was upset that she could not have been out here longer. And then we get into the tragedy of Amelia Earhart's life. She was born in 1897, and her final flight happened in 1937. 40 years of her life, and only 16 of those spent flying. And in those 16 years, she achieved so much. 1937 was going to be her world flight attempt, circumnavigate the globe. And you can see up on the screen is a map, and it's not very clear, but you can see the yellow line. Where the yellow line starts in California is where her flight started in late May, and she flew across the United States all the way to Florida. And then on June 1st, she left Miami for her circumnavigating the globe attempt, her world flight attempt. She was with a navigator by the name of Fred Noonan, and Fred helped her navigate her trip. And then her trip ended and failed. Amelia Earhart, like I said, started her trip around the world on June 1st, 1937, with Fred Noonan. On July 2nd, which is obviously quite a bit of time after, they took off from Lai, New Guinea, headed for Howland Island. Howland Island, this is in the Pacific Ocean, and they had a U.S. Coast Guard cutter, the Itasca, stationed right offshore of Howland Island to help aid navigation. It was not necessarily an easy thing to do to navigate a plane. By dawn of that day, Amelia Earhart had called the Itasca, reporting it to be cloudy weather, and she later asked for the ship to take bearings on her. And the ship sent a steady stream of transmissions, but she could not hear them. And they're not really sure why. They weren't sure if it was weather affecting radio traffic or if it was just her radio or maybe the ship's radio failing. At 7:42 in the morning, the Itasca heard a message. We must be on you, but we cannot see you. Fuel is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet. And then at 8:45 in the morning, Amelia Earhart reported, we are running north and south. And then that was her last radio transmission. Nothing was heard from her again. By that point, she should have had landed at Howland Island. The resulting search and rescue attempt was one of the most extensive air and sea searches in naval history, if not the most extensive. The U.S. government actually ended up spending about $4 million at the time and searched 250,000 square miles of ocean. After that, the U.S. government called off the search, and the result was a tragedy all around the world that was felt all around the world. There is a lighthouse on Howland Island dedicated to Amelia Earhart. There are roads all over the United States and most likely all over the world named after her. But it wasn't just her disappearance that changed things. It was the theories of what happened to her that were most important. And there have been so many theories. One theory is that she actually ended up landing at the Marshall Islands or near the Marshall Islands by Japan or in the Pacific Ocean, and she was Japanese, or she was captured by the Japanese. And the photo that you see on the right here is supposedly the proof of that. This photo was found in the National Archives. It was released from a U.S. Naval Intelligence file. And I'm going to see if I can move my mouse here to show you. Here we go. So there is a woman sitting right here. That woman is believed to be Amelia Earhart. The man over here is believed to be Fred Noonan. And then back here, it's not clear at all, but that is apparently supposed to be a plane, and it would be Amelia Earhart's plane. And so a lot of people are taking this photo to be the proof that they actually died in Japanese custody. And then there are a lot of other people who are refuting that, saying that this photo would have had to have been taken within the couple of days of the disappearance, which is possible, but it's unknown and it can't be proven. Another theory is that they crashed and died immediately, which, you know, from a certain height, if you hit water, it feels like concrete. And so that's a very legitimate theory. And then another theory is that Amelia Earhart at least survived for a couple of days, if not weeks afterward. And she ended up stranded on an island that was uninhabited. And this theory is supported in that there was a partial skeleton found in the 1940s on a Pacific island that shows similarities to Amelia Earhart. In 1941, when the skeleton was tested, scientists believe that it was a male skeleton. Now there has been retesting done, and because technology is so different now than it was in 1941, scientists are actually beginning to see the similarities between the bones that they found in the 1940s and Amelia Earhart's stature. Also found among the bones was a piece of a woman's shoe, a box that was made to hold a sextant, which would have been used to be a navigational tool, and a bottle of Benedictine, which was an herbal liquor. The bottom line is that nobody really truly knows what happened to Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan or their plane. I believe that a lot of people see it as a treasure hunt of sorts now. But what she did and what she achieved cannot be taken away. And so let's talk about her importance. In a letter to her husband that she wrote before her circumnavigation around the globe attempt, she wrote, "Please know I am quite aware of the hazards. I want to do it because I want to do it. Women must try to do things as men have tried. When they fail, their failure must be but a challenge to others." And she lived that. She did things because she wanted to do them. She did this world attempt because she wanted to do it. She not only influenced female aviators, but the general aviation movement as well. And her independence, her belief system has stuck with hundreds of thousands of women and young girls over decades. And if we could all just be as successful as Amelia Earhart was in 40 years, I think we'd all be in an amazing place. Thank you for joining me and the Journey Museum and Learning Center today. This is our sources. Newspapers.com has a fascinating amount of articles about Amelia Earhart, and then the Smithsonian databases have been extremely helpful as well. Photos are from ameliaearhart.com, where it talks all about the woman and her history, and those are places that I'd recommend perusing if you ever get the time.